a classic sound of Friday the 13th. The calm but sinister waters of Camp Crystal Lake, synonymous with the series. The iconic hockey mask and machete, that means Jason Vorhees is here and ready to terrorize teens. All elements that the next film might not have. This past summer, one of the most iconic and the longest running horror franchises of all time turned 40 years old. Friday the 13th. And yet, despite being such an iconic series, despite the fact it has a successful video game, despite there being a horror renaissance and even a slasher renaissance with fellow icon Michael Myers coming back to great acclaim and box office, and even during this massive 80s nostalgia that we're currently experiencing, there hasn't been a Friday the 13th film since 2009. And right now, it looks like there might never be one again. Well, there might be. Or there might be a Friday the 13th film that's not called Friday the 13th, but it'll have Camp Crystal Lake. And it'll have Jason, but Jason can't wear a hockey mask and he'd have to be a kid. Or maybe there'll be a Friday the 13th film with Jason grown up, but we can't mention his surname or his origin or Camp Crystal. It's confusing. The rights are currently pretty baffling, but basically it boils down to Jason's two daddies are having a custody fight over their murderous mutant zombie child to see who will get the rights. And it's not just limited to Friday the 13th, because the outcome of this case could mean a lot for the rest of Hollywood too. The rights at the moment are murkier than the waters of Camp Crystal Lake itself, so let's dive in. This is Fight for Your Rights. So to get a full grasp on how this situation developed, how the rights got so weird, we need to go back to the development and production of the original Friday the 13th. And to be honest, there's nothing original about Friday the 13th. And I don't mean that as a sign of disrespect. I just mean it because, really, to get the full story of Friday the 13th, you need to go back before it began and look at the history of a different franchise. Another iconic slasher for the series. Back in 1978, John Carpenter released Halloween, which, on a budget of $325,000, made around $70 million from domestic and international grosses, which, in modern grosses, is about 4 times that much. It was mostly carried by positive word of mouth. Back then, horror wasn't really something that was massively released. It was essentially limited to certain theaters, and because of that, horror generally succeeded on strong word of mouth. And because of that, horror was normally an independent genre. And that's why, to date, Halloween stands as one of the most successful independent films of all time. This is basically how horror films throughout that era performed. There was limited openings around the country, and it was just sort of a toss-up to see how it would actually do. They were made pretty cheaply and generally made just enough money to justify their existence. But when this was such a massive success, people sat up and took notice. It's 1979, and we're in Stratford, Connecticut. A struggling screenwriter's phone is ringing. His name is Victor Miller. And on the other end of the phone is a friend of his, a producer that is equally struggling to make it. This is Sean S. Cunningham. Before long, the two men come to discuss the mammoth success of Halloween. A success they no doubt have pined for. This is a phone call that would define both their lives and careers. When Sean S. Cunningham explains the reason for calling, not just to talk about Halloween, but to tell Victor Miller that he intends to rip it off. Miller is somewhat unsure of what to make of all this, but wonders what Sean S. Cunningham actually has in mind for this film aside from trying to imitate Halloween, to which Cunningham states he only has a title: Friday the 13th. These are the two men who would give us Friday the 13th. Before this, they were really barely notable. Sean S. Cunningham was a struggling producer and filmmaker who was just getting by directing adverts or softcore pornography. And seeing more money in family films, he decided to chase the success of the Bad News Bears and approached Victor Miller to write a script, for which they made 2 films, Manny's Orphans and Here Come the Tigers, both of which were totally unremarkable and unsuccessful, and seen as cashing in and trying to rip off the bad news bears. It seems really that Cunningham's goal is to cash in on the latest craze, and because of that, it's no surprise that he wanted to chase the success of Halloween.
Halloween, the night he came home.
One of his only successes prior to Jason had been that he was a producer on Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left. And yet his success in horror was far from a guarantee. I mean, he produced in 1976 the film The People Who Own the Dark, a film not even worthy of a Wikipedia page, apparently. The success of the first Friday the 13th film would be a high point of both men's careers. Despite only having a title, they run with it, with barely an idea of what the film is or will be, and not even a finished script. They put an ad in Variety advertising Friday the 13th as from the producer of Last House on the Left, and hope to get some funding, which apparently worked because the financiers and distributors of Last House on the Left come on board Sean's new project. The only problem is they don't have a script, and things are moving fast after financing is sorted. So Friday the 13th starts coming together, and it needs to come together really quickly. So Victor Miller starts pounding out a script. Now, I should say Victor Miller also wasn't the only writer, but he is the only credited writer. There was some uncredited rewrites by Ron Kurz, who would eventually write Friday the 13th Part 2, but he doesn't even get credit. Sean S. Cunningham is also on board to direct Friday the 13th. So, what do we need for this film? Because we don't have a lot of time. Well, we need a setting that's devoid of children. Summer camp, there we go. What about characters and story? Yeah, we don't need those. This is a trashy, fun, bloody time anyway. We don't need characters. No one's going to care. After all, it's a cash-in. Why bother giving it much thought? The film wanted to be Halloween in its box office numbers, but tonally the film wanted to be less of a slow, tense thriller and more of a roller coaster ride that got people into the seats with their ambitious and gory kills. One thing they definitely wanted for the film, though, was a surprise reveal of who the killer was. And even that was rushed, because originally they wanted to put some more hints towards who this killer was going to be. Like, for example, the killer would lose a finger, and later on we would see a character missing a finger, so maybe they're the killer. But that was cut. That was cut for budget and time reasons, so there's not a lot of hints to who the killer is. Surprise, that the killer is this person. Didn't see that coming? Well, that was because we didn't give you any other option. But it's not the only thing that's rushed from production. For example, even though the effects by Tom Savini are outstanding, he admits that some of the most ambitious kills were also cut for budget and for time, which is such a shame because this series would be totally ravaged by the MPAA. And here they didn't even get a chance to do some of their most ambitious kills before it became such a megalithic success. Instead, the film sort of plays off the traditional summer of Americana, which is that kids go away to a summer camp and do all the sort of things they don't want their parents to see. That would make them really mad, like sex and drugs and alcohol. But there was no parent who was more pissed off than anyone else. Mrs. Voorhees.
How are you? Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
That's right, the surprise twist that the killer was actually Jason's mother. A great misdirect to the audience and quite a progressive step in defining that the killer can also be female, even though it played with audience's expectations that the serial killer in the film is probably male. Halloween wasn't the only film to inform Friday the 13th, though. Sean S. Cunningham specifically mentioned that he wanted the film to have a psycho influence, in that our lead character, seemingly our POV character at the start of the film, is introduced and then unceremoniously killed off, which was very much like the Janet Leigh role in Psycho. It's also not the only psycho influence we see. Victor Miller, to his own admission, says he may have been unknowingly influenced by Psycho, in that in Psycho we have a son obsessed with his mother killing for her, whereas here we have the reverse of that. It's a mother killing for her son who has passed on and is basically has an unhealthy obsession and conflict because of that death. It's sort of like a reverse Norman Bates situation. But it's also not the only film that has influenced the first film in the series, because Carrie was also a massive influence on it. Carrie finishes, or comes to an end, with a massive hand jumping out of a grave of a character we thought we were dead. And it was a kind of a dream sequence. And because of that, we get that scene essentially in Friday the 13th, when Jason emerges from the lake and tries to drown the woman that killed his mother in a massive twist that stunned audiences. But it was a dream. A lot of the Friday the 13th films early on end in dreams. Doesn't make a lot of sense or continuity, but sure. Now, I will note as well here that Victor Miller said that he didn't like the idea of so blatantly stealing from Carrie. In fact, he didn't write this ending. Ron Kurz did. But he has begrudgingly admitted since that the film feels incomplete without it and has sort of grown to appreciate and like it. During production, there doesn't seem to be any real friction between the two men. Victor Miller and Sean Cunningham seem totally aware of the film they're making, and they should be pretty happy with the end result. This was massively successful. Firstly, it was picked up by Paramount, which is unheard of for an independent horror film at the time, and by today's standards, it would have cost $4.5 million and grossed $177 million. Huge success for Paramount. But what's also surprising is that this is essentially the end of the road with those two guys involved with the franchise for the most part. I mean, aside from some of the entries, saying based upon characters created by Jason, the only character anyone care about, they made him. They made Jason. That's the only character anyone cares about in Friday the 13th. Now, I will say, Victor Miller totally done with the franchise. He never returns. Sean Cunningham does return as a producer eventually when the series moves to New Line from its 9th entry. Jason Goes to Hell, Jason X, Freddy vs. Jason, and the reboot. He's involved, but it seems mostly as a token role, if we're honest. But the question is, why does that happen? I mean, these were the people that basically gave life to such a successful franchise, and then they were basically not involved anymore. Well, we don't really know the answer to that. Victor Miller, though, was pretty critical of the direction they went with the Friday the 13th sequels. He wrote the film as having Ms. Voorhees as the character, as the killer, and that was it. Jason was a victim. I mean, a lot of people are actually sympathetic to Mrs. Voorhees. She lost her son, and as a result, some people show a great deal of sympathy to her character, something that Miller probably agrees with. He just had real issues with turning Jason into the bad guy. According to him, Jason was dead from the very beginning. He was a victim, not a villain. He also felt that one of the stronger aspects of his film was having a mother be the killer. It was driven by a desire to avenge her son, something people could relate to. So perhaps this could point to something that you could say maybe left Miller feeling somewhat cheapened by the sequels that followed, that perhaps it lessened his original film and what he was going for. But aside from that, I mean, there was no real friction between the two men at all. And even then, Cunningham wasn't involved with most of those sequels. So the question then becomes, where does this conflict arise? And are you surprised that it arises from everything that every conflict arises from? Money. So what is this big legal battle I keep alluding to? Well, I should say right now we are at the longest gap ever between Friday the 13th sequels. There has not been a Friday the 13th film since 2009, the one that was made by Paramount and Platinum Dunes. And since then, the rights have gone back to New Line / Warner Brothers as of 2016. But all the last while, since then, there has been a bitter rivalry and court case between Sean S. Cunningham and Victor Miller over the rights to the series, and specifically the rights to the first film. And all of this goes back to an act that was passed in 1976, in which, according to Congress, authors can reclaim the rights to their created property and even the granting of those rights after 35 years. This, however, isn't necessarily foolproof. There's one big caveat. For example, if you are a work for hire, for example, it happens a lot in comic books. If you create a character for Marvel or DC, you don't own that character. You were hired by them, and as a result, whatever character you create belongs to them. And a lot of that fight stems on whether or not Victor Miller was, in fact, a work for hire. Miller is saying in court that he created Jason. He wrote the script and created the characters, and what you see in the first Friday the 13th film is all his, as he wrote the script. Meanwhile, the people he's fighting against, Horror Inc. and the Manny Corporation, who were formerly known as Georgetown Productions, alleged that he was hired by Sean Cunningham as a work for hire, and as a result, whatever he created is theirs. So this is an incredibly messy case, but I'll try sum it up as best I can. Sean Cunningham, for example, definitively came up with the title, and he was advertising the movie before there was even a script. But things were rushed and maybe something slipped through the cracks. Because normally in those scenarios, chances are the person would have been a work for hire. But during this court case and in examining the agreement that Victor Miller signed, there is no actual mention of work for hire. But Cunningham's side are saying Sean Cunningham came up with the title. He came up with a lot of the creative ideas and had final creative say. He got the financing, he was advertising it, and basically has been guiding this series going forward to some degree. And in that regard, he should control the rights. Essentially, it's more his than it is Victor Miller's. But Miller side is saying that he's a member of the Writers Guild, and what he signed was a standard employment agreement and not a work for hire one. So in that regard, he should control the rights because he wasn't a work for hire. He created it, and according to the agreement, it's his. However, normally those agreements would mean that the rights would stay with the original owner, which would be Sean Cunningham. But then we get into more confusing territory. Like, even though this was a Writers Guild agreement, Miller's lawyers point to a lack of paid vacation, health insurance, or contributions to his pension as evidence that the company didn't provide him with traditional employment benefits, and that as such, he could not be considered an employee, which in that case, he would own the rights because he wrote the script himself, essentially. And Miller basically says that. He says that he wrote the script on spec, essentially, without supervision or input, and aside from changing the ending, he says this is very much his script and therefore his property. The big question in general is how much input do you have to have on a creative idea to be considered at least partly or wholly the owner of that idea? Because as much as it might say Victor Miller, Sean Cunningham came up with the title and he had some form of a vision, but he couldn't fully realize that vision. That's why he hired Victor Miller in the first place. But seemingly he gave feedback to Miller and he gave him some ideas and tried to steer him in a certain direction. He gave Victor Miller notes. So in that regard, does he have a claim to being at least partly the owner? And it's a question that doesn't really have an answer. It's something that's debated often in creative arts in general. Does this person deserve a writing credit? Is this person a creator? That's a question that's going to be debated long after this case and in general going forward when it comes to creative arts. The problem here is that it's put under a legal microscope and they need a definitive answer. And that's why in 2018, Victor Miller beat Sean Cunningham and got the domestic rights to the first Friday the 13th film. And while this might seem like an open and shut case, it's still incredibly messy because there's things that undoubtedly now both sides own, and there's other things that aren't entirely clear. For example, definitively, Sean S. Cunningham owns the name Friday the 13th. He created that. So he can have a Friday the 13th film, but he can't call the character Jason Vorhees, possibly. And he definitely can't have Count Crystal Lake or Mrs. Voorhees or anything about Jason's origin in general. But he can have Jason with a hockey mask because that was introduced in the later entries. Whereas Victor Miller can have films, but they can't be called Friday the 13th. But he can have Jason and call him Jason Vorhees, but probably only have Jason as a child as he was introduced in the first film. And he can have Mrs. Voorhees and Count Crystal Lake and his origin in general, but he can't use Jason with a mask and a machete because that's introduced in a later sequel. So essentially, he can make bootleg Friday the 13th films that have some of the legitimate stuff, but doesn't have what we associate with the Jason character. Essentially, we have two incomplete sets here that don't necessarily work unless they're put together. And there is one other possibility, as unlikely as it is. Since this is just the domestic rights to the series, Sean Cunningham could technically make a complete Friday the 13th film using whatever he wants and only release it internationally, which means the film would be banned in America. I know a lot of people wanted Friday the 13th films banned at one point. Maybe it could still happen. Cunningham has been fighting to try to reverse the court's decision, but certainly for now, the rights are split in such an ugly way you would think Jason himself macheted them down the middle. But there has been some legal proceedings since then. For example, the case was thrown to the Second Circuit Court, which is for appeals and could potentially and unlikely end up in the Supreme Court. So this could basically go a few different ways. The first way it could go is that the court might find that Victor Miller does in fact own the domestic rights to Friday the 13th. And if it goes that way, I mean, let's be honest, they're pretty useless without the Sean Cunningham half. Now, the court might also find that, on appeal, Sean Cunningham actually does own the rights to Friday the 13th. I mean, if that did happen, I mean, he might appeal that again and it might go to the Supreme Court, apparently. I'm not a legal person despite these lasses. If Cunningham did win, they could basically go back to work as usual. But another possibility is that maybe Miller and Cunningham will actually collaborate and come to some sort of agreement. I mean, even though some people are kind of demonizing Victor Miller, he is entitled to some degree of the profits. He created this character and the film that basically launched it. And while Cunningham has apparently been making a lot of money from the sequels, Miller hasn't really seen anything. And this isn't about profits from before. This is about profits of future entries and where the rights to Friday the 13th are going to end up. The last update on this case was in February of 2020 when they were last in court, and there was still no end in sight for this legal mess. So, save for some sort of mediation, an agreement being reached between the two men, it might be quite some time before we see Jason back on the big screen. But what's also interesting is that this isn't just a big deal for the Friday the 13th series. This is something that is going to massively affect 80s cinema in general and Hollywood going forward. You see, using this 35-year rule, plenty of creators and writers could potentially recover the rights to their properties. Wes Craven's estate has used this same method to recover the domestic rights to A Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger. Gale Ann Hurd is hoping to use this to get the rights back to Terminator. It also applies to people who sold the rights to their books. Gary K. Wolfe, who censored Roger Rabbit, which of course became Who Framed Roger Rabbit, is hoping to retain the rights to his book. Die Hard was based on a book called Nothing Lasts Forever, and the heirs to that writer are hoping to get the rights back to that book, meaning that they would own the rights to essentially Die Hard.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
Stephen King is hoping to get the rights back to a number of his books: The Mist, Dead Zone, Cujo, Creepshow, Children of the Corn, Cat's Eye, and Firestarter. Similarly, Clive Barker is hoping to get the rights back to Hellraiser by the end of 2021, using this method. Beetlejuice and Predator are also potentially going to have the rights taken back off the studios using this copyright method. Essentially, it means that any property post-1976 that had its rights sold 35 years ago could now be up for grabs, whether that's a script that was written or the rights to a certain IP. They could now be returning to their creators, and studios might be saying goodbye to some of the most iconic and long-running franchises, especially, for now at least, from the 80s. Which means that these franchises could be done for good unless a studio decides to repurchase the rights. Or maybe they could even end up at another studio and have some of these rights be twisted, whereas they can follow some of the original rights, but they can't follow something from a previous film. As such, the future will likely include many more fights for the rights of Hollywood's most tenured franchises, and while the battle rages on to see who can rightfully make a Jason film, or at least a Jason film fans would actually want to see, the real nightmare might be for studios who will see their most valued properties yanked out from underneath them. And while it's a fantastic win for writers and control over the rights to their creation, it's not so much a good thing for those hoping to see Jason stalk the foggy woods of Camp Crystal Lake once more. So, it's been about a year since I did that feature for the podcast, and I was putting together the standalone version you just watched, and we got an update. For the first time in a long time, we got an update. About 4 weeks ago, the Court of Appeals sided with Victor Miller, basically confirmed and reaffirmed the decision that they made originally, that he owns the domestic rights to Friday the 13th, the original film, as it were. So the question then becomes, are we now closer to a Friday the 13th film, or as far away as we always were? And we're sort of in the same boat, really, where we just have to watch and see what Sean S. Cunningham is going to do next, because he's kind of has less options than he did. He could appeal this decision and try, go for it again with a more full panel at the courthouse, I believe. But, is that just kind of wasting time? Is it really just going to give the same result? He could petition to get it to the Supreme Court. Again, is it going to be a lot of work for not a lot of reward when they would basically come to the same decision? And it seems like, if nothing else, one of the things that's kind of broken the camel's back here is the fact that they've pretty much definitively now confirmed that Victor Miller wasn't a work for hire. And that means that it's likely he will win
any of the court cases coming at him, I would imagine. Also interesting, I talked about how this was going to be a kind of massive headache for Hollywood going forward, and the same lawyer who represented Victor Miller, and obviously won, is now taking cases against Marvel Comics because of the heirs of the creators of some of those characters. Now, not the same situation, a lot of those probably were work for hire, but it will be interesting to see how that comes about, and certainly this could be kind of a monumental decision that could affect Hollywood for the next few years. So that's kind of what Sean S. Cunningham can do, I guess. He can try again, but at a certain point he's probably running out of options. So the only thing left to do is Warner Brothers can say, hey, let's make a Friday the 13th film, but we can't acknowledge his origins or Camp Crystal Lake or a lot of the stuff that we associate with Jason. Will they do that? I mean, the New Line films kind of did that anyway. They didn't really acknowledge his origins that much. It was kind of... And they weren't called Friday the 13th either, so, you know, it's not like this is something insurmountable. I don't think Victor Miller really has any interest in doing a film with his portion of the rights. So it just comes down to whether or not they can come to a deal, or more likely that a studio or a production company sees enough interest in Jason and the Friday the 13th franchise that they're willing to cut a check to get those rights kind of combined and make a new Friday the 13th. The thing is, I think especially considering it's been so long since we've had another Friday the 13th film, you kind of have to have it all together, because I think you kind of might have to start again, and it's not easy to do that when you're missing the origin and all this sort of thing, unless they do a totally new fresh take, and then that could be a risky venture because people might not be interested in not getting what it is they expect out of a Friday the 13th film. So it's a kind of an interesting position. We will see where it goes. But yeah, interesting that Jason was unstoppable, unkillable, and now he's been beaten by lawyers. Who saw that one coming? I don't know. Maybe if there's a big update in the near future, I'll make another video. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, give it a like, and be sure to subscribe for more stuff. Anyway.